Forgotten Bombs, Bali 2005, deals with suicide in the context of suicide bombings. Death and murder feature. Please take care while listening.
Previously on Forgotten Bombs, Bali 2005.
When it went off, I remember flying through the air and thinking I'm going to die, and I thought, who's going to look after my kids?
There were white tiles and that on the floor, but there was blood everywhere. And I went out to another room and there were dead bodies everywhere, lined up, and families coming in and wailing over them.
Looking at these hospital beds, seeing blood, being incredibly grateful that I was alive and conscious so that I could keep my leg, which had an open wound, above the bloody sheet that I was on.
From 9.6 Digital, this is Forgotten Bombs, Bali 2005. I'm Joe Frost. On the 2nd of October 2005, the day after the bombing, Mum woke me at dawn. Dad wants you to go to the hospital with everyone's passports, she said. Being a doctor, Dad had gone to a nearby hospital the night before to help with the injuries. Still, I was confused. But everyone's okay, I said. Why do they need passports? Who's leaving the country? Mum said she didn't know, just that Dad had asked for me to get the passports of everyone who was in hospital and get over there as soon as possible. I made my way around the hotel halls, knocking on doors to pick up passports. Dane Griffiths, Vicky and Kim's son, told me he was coming. Dane had been my best mate in primary school and, having been to Bali plenty of times before, he had been showing me the ropes over our first few days. I was glad to have his company. When I knocked on Dietmar Letterwash's door, he said he was coming too. Dad's best mate, Deet, and I had always been close. But we had walked through hell together the night before. Our bond was now inextricable. Within an hour, Deet, Dane and I were in a taxi headed for Sanglah Hospital in downtown Denpasar, arriving in the blazing sunshine of what was already a stifling Bali day. Dad stood out front of the hospital, hugged each of us individually, then gestured for us to follow him. The largest medical facility on the island of Bali, Sanglah was unlike any Australian hospital I had ever been in. From the outside, it looked like a simple 2-story building. However, Sanglah spread out over a large area, with the various wings connected by long outdoor corridors, covered from the elements by Balinese-style roofs. Sanglah had been overwhelmed when hundreds of people came through its doors in the aftermath of the 2002 Bali bombing, unprepared for the amount of brutal burn injuries. In response, the Australian government had given a multi-million-dollar gift to establish the 12 October Australia Memorial Centre at Sanglah. It was in this newly built ward where Dad was now treating the people from Newcastle he had come on holiday with. We stopped at the doors to the ward and I finally asked, "Dad, what's going on?" He laid the extent of the devastation out for us. Fractured limbs, a destroyed eye, detached retinas, shrapnel wounds that Dad compared to being blasted with a shotgun. These injuries would change people's lives forever. Penny and Paul Anisich's lives were still hanging in the balance. I remember Dad using the phrase "circling the drain" to describe Paul. But Dad saved the real gut punch for last. And Jennifer Williamson, he took a moment. Jennifer has passed away. Dietmar, Dane and I were all too stunned by what we had just learned to truly come to terms with it all. Then Dad took us into the ward and we saw firsthand the devastation that had been wrought by Salek Ferdos and his backpack. Around about the time I was being awoken by the phone call to get the passports, someone else in Bali was also waking to unexpected news. Tony Abbott was then the Minister for Health, but on that day in 2005, he just happened to be on holiday in Bali with his family. At around 5 a.m, the landline in his hotel room rang. It was his sister.
And she said, "Are you all right?" And I said, "What do you mean, are we all right?" "Of course we're all right." And she said, "There's been a bombing." And I was momentarily incredulous. And then when she explained that there had been a bombing and that a number of Australians had been killed and a number of Australians were badly hurt, I thought, well, I'd better, I suppose, do something, because at that time I was the health minister in the Howard government. And I figured that as the man on the spot, when Australians were in trouble, I should be as useful to them as I could be. So I put my running shoes on, ran down into the heart of Kuta, where one of the bombs had gone off. Obviously, the police had blocked off the street. There were security people all around. I managed to find someone who appeared to be an authority, and I said, "Well, what's happened to all the people who were hurt?" I was told that they'd gone off to the Sanglah Hospital. So I then ran back to the hotel, told Margie and the girls that I wasn't going to be able to be with them that day, but I then jumped in a taxi and got to the Sanglah Hospital.
My dad, Dr. Adam Frost, had almost 30 years' experience. While his day job was as a suburban GP, he also worked as a surgeon's assistant.
It was mostly joint replacements, and we did our share of semi-urgent trauma, fractures, compounds, people who couldn't be seen quick enough we'd look after, come in after hours. I'd done a few amputations, so there wasn't anything as horrific as the injuries were. I think I was a little accustomed to that.
So had you been in a mass casualty event at that point?
No.
After Dietmar and I had arrived safely back to the hotel the night before, Dad had made a beeline for a hospital in Kuta called BIMC, ready to treat these people who may have been his patients, but who were also his friends. My dad is an understated man. He considers his words carefully, he is humble, and he has no desire to be in the spotlight. Basically, we are complete opposites. So I won't correct him or offer a different point of view on what he remembers. I will simply say that our memories diverge, not on what happened, but on the size of the role he played. Because in his recollections, he paints himself as a glorified passenger. But I was there too, at least for a while. I saw him make phone calls in which he gave family members back in Australia awful updates on the long-term health of their loved ones. At one point, I had to fetch him from the hospital morgue, where he was identifying the deceased. And people who had been there the night before told me the difference he made at critical moments. But here's how he saw things.
By the time we got to BIMC, everything was sorted. That was amazing. The authorities, doctors, medical staff, ambulances, they just had everything sorted. It was like, "Oh, you're dead, you go in this pile here. You're injured, you go here. You're seriously injured, you go to Denpasar." I thought the triaging had all been done by the time I got there. I must admit, I thought I could be useful, just to help deal with trauma. But as I said, you're either dead or, I'm not trying to downplay the injuries, but you were alive and still talking. And all of the people that I saw, I thought, as bad as your injuries are, eye injuries, ear injuries, shrapnel injuries, you're going to survive. And the only person I thought would not survive was Paul Anasich. And my triaging of Paul was, he's going to die.
On the 1st of October 2005, Paul Anasich was the chairman of Spark Helmore, a law firm that had operated in Newcastle for more than 100 years. A big man with a bigger personality, Paul and his wife, Penny, were a picture of success.
Well, we lived a charmed life. We had this house. We both worked. James was away at school, So most weekends we went to Sydney to a flat we had in Potts Point. We had a house of blueies, which we spent a lot of time at. So we had a charmed life. But Paul worked hard and I worked, so, that was life.
Penny Anisic is the face that stands out when I think of that morning at Sanglah Hospital. English by birth, Penny has an accent to complement her personality and sense of style. So I remember the shock of seeing her laid up in a hospital bed, her hair a mess of blood and sand, her body a patchwork of shrapnel blasts.
I think when you're that close to the end, you're beyond pain. I got cut from my chest to below my navel to take shrapnel out. My lungs had collapsed. The retinas had been torn off. Some of my teeth had gone missing. Because the bomb had sucked everything out of you. It sucked the oxygen out of your lungs as well. I think my lungs had collapsed. And I can remember Julia being there. And according to Julia, I was very calm. Even though I said to her, "Do you think I'll die?"
But if Penny's wounds were life-threatening, her husband's appeared life-ending.
Paul Anisic seemed to have copped the bulk of the ball bearings. Well, when I first saw him, he was unconscious. He obviously had multiple shrapnel wounds. He was in shock. The monitor attached to him showed, his pulse rate was tachycardia, 150. His blood pressure was low. They had fluids up, and he was in fast AF, fast atrial fibrillation.
One of 3 doctors in our family, my oldest and youngest brothers followed in his footsteps. Dad's got a habit of peppering conversation with medical jargon and thinking I know what he's talking about. So I'll defer to Dietmar, who was taken to the intensive care unit to see Paul.
He was just lying on the table. He looked like a white whale washed up on the beach, covered in red dots, all the shrapnel hit him. And I thought, I'll never see Paul again. So I just bent over and kissed him on the forehead and said, "See you later, mate."
A woman from the hotel turned up during the course of the morning, having been given the awful task of finding out what had happened to whom. She introduced herself and was almost immediately in tears, apologising for what had happened. She had in her hand a piece of paper, which was divided into 3 columns. Those who were alive, those who were deceased, and those who were missing. Jennifer Williamson's name was in her missing column. We told her that Jennifer's name would need to move, and she broke down in tears again. A few other names we were able to help her account for. Then Dane asked after the 2 people we had not been able to find. "Have you seen Colin and Fiona Zwolinski?" She looked at us. Then she pointed down to the piece of paper. Their names were written in the deceased column. My morning at Sanglah Hospital was a series of awful tableaux. Witnessing a parade of bodies covered in yellow plastic sheeting being taken into the hospital morgue. Watching my father tell one of my childhood friends the worst news of his young life. Being told by multiple expats to be very careful not to say anything negative about Bali. It was nothing I had ever experienced before. A constant stream of cognitive dissonance. Then, at some point in the morning, the future Prime Minister of Australia arrived and introduced himself to me simply as Tony.
By that stage, it was probably about 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock in the morning. And it was shortly after that I ran into your dad, who looked like a man with many cares. I then spent most of the rest of the day with your father in the various places where the Australians were being treated. As someone who has been in hospital much more often to comfort others than to be treated myself, there's not a lot of practical help you can give, not being one of the professional staff. You can sort of feel like the third wheel when you're in a hospital. But because of the authority which I guess a Minister of the Crown in a situation like that has, I guess I was able to put in phone calls to ministers back in Australia. I was able to speak to the media with a degree of authority. I was able to talk to some of the advisors of the Indonesians who visited. I mean, to the great credit of the Indonesians, both the then President SBY and his predecessor, Megawati, both came to the Sanglah Hospital that day to, amongst other things, I suppose, express solidarity and sympathy with the Australians who'd been so horrifically injured. So the Indonesians, to their great credit, really went to all the lengths possible to do the right thing by the injured Australians.
While his standing as a senior minister in the Howard government would come to bear, a lot of the help Tony provided was simple, practical, and, for Vicky Griffiths, provided some relief.
And I remember I said to Dane, now Dane, my bag was still on the beach and it had a credit card in there and all my cash and stuff. I said, you're going to have to cancel the credit card, mate. And he said, oh, rightio, I'll do that. I'll find out how to do that. And he's walking out of the hospital and there's a guy walking towards him and Dane said, hey, mate, I don't know who you are, but I know you're somebody important. I need to cancel my mum's credit card. Do you know how I could do that? And it was Tony Abbott. And Tony Abbott said, yeah, mate, give me the details. I'll get it done for you.
I asked Tony about this exchange, and he reminded me of the simple fact that 20 years ago, instantaneous communication from a foreign country was still relatively rare.
Not only did we not all have mobile phones back in 2005, but I dare say mobile phones with international coverage would have been, I mean, we take it all for granted now, but just 20 years ago, things weren't quite what they are. I had a mobile phone, and so I was probably able to make phone calls that couldn't otherwise be made. So I'm pleased that I was able to be useful.
Dad remembers Tony Abbott's mixture of practicality and humanity.
I thought he was very effective, just at organising people. He knew who to contact. He was aware of the diplomacy, who he could talk to and what he could say. He was very careful. He did not criticise anybody. He was fairly deprecating, if anything. You know, I'm a tourist, I'm not the health minister for Australia. There were a couple of times where he just pulled back and went, no, let them do what they've got to do. I think of David Marr's essay about Tony Abbott, where people hate him with a passion, but anybody who knows him says he's a really good bloke. And that was my impression. In the burns unit, Tony walked in with one day and he had a whole tray, like a dozen Krispy Kreme donuts. So he'd gone to the Krispy Kreme shop and bought all these Krispy Kreme donuts and then took them in for the staff. He was so well-meaning, you know, like he always wanted to buy you a coffee or something else and a tray of donuts.
Given Tony Abbott was such a central figure that day, I had always assumed that he had played some sort of lone hand in communicating to the government the seriousness of our situation. And I don't doubt that his presence made a world of difference. But much like I didn't grasp how many people it takes to plan and execute a terrorist attack of this size until years later, it was only after speaking with former AFP Detective Superintendent David Craig that I got a proper grasp of just how big an operation it was to bring us all home safely.
Your focus is on human life. That's the most important thing. Like, of course we want to catch these people, but not as much as we want to save the people that have been harmed by it. So our first and primary effort then was to get Australians' medical help, and not just Australians, obviously everybody. So I stood up a coordination centre in Canberra to be staffed 24 hours a day, probably about 100 people in total in Canberra working full-time on it within a number of hours. We were very lucky because we had some people from the counter-terrorism unit in Jakarta actually in Bali at the time. So that was really good because they had been involved with Bali 1 already. They were able to establish a small forward command post there, which was great. So they were my liaison immediately. So right away I had boots on the ground there and I was getting updates. I was just saying, ring me every half hour. I know everything that's going on. And that was the start of a 31-hour shift that I worked. And the other guys on the ground would have worked similar hours, I would expect, because there is no way to step down when there's human lives at stake and you're wanting to get people flown from Bali to Singapore to Darwin to Perth to wherever we can get the best medical care. And then you've also, the back of your mind is we also don't want to lose all the evidence that may be on these people, that these people may have or other tourists may have. So I've got every international flight from the time of the bombing for the next 2 days met by federal police with questionnaires for people, asking for film or photos from around that time because we just didn't know who or what we were actually looking for to start with. So I flew to Canberra.
As mentioned in a previous episode, David was not supposed to start his role as head of counter-terrorism until the following Monday, so you couldn't even say this was his first day. Yet he was on a flight from Queensland to Canberra that night. In the capital, he attended the International Department Emergency Task Force, which consisted of some 14 government departments. Initially reluctant to make his voice heard, he soon came to realise he had the strongest understanding of what was happening on the ground.
And it wasn't because of me, it was just very fortunate that we had good people on the ground in Bali and we had good communications with them, and so we had really up-to-date information, and that helped gauge how many RAF flights that Defence were going to send over to Bali to bring people home. To a crisis hotline, Centrelink were involved. It was a whole of government response, and I have to say, if ever you're overseas and part of a major catastrophe like this, as you were, Joe, then rest assured there's a lot of good Australians working very hard, all political differences, everything's aside, it's all about the job, and it was very rewarding for me to be part of that.
So it had taken more than Tony Abbott to make it happen. A lot more, as it turned out. But as the afternoon of October 2 wore on, it was Tony Abbott who finally delivered some good news to my dad.
But as it became apparent over the first day that everyone was sorted, they were appropriately looked after, the serious injuries were awaiting transfer to Singapore, and everyone else we were just waiting to get to Darwin. I can't remember at what stage we ran into Tony Abbott, but that was reassuring that he said, the RAF is coming.
I had never really considered just how much planning and logistical support was required to ensure that none of us from Newcastle involved in the October 1 bombing woke up in Bali on October 3. There may have been some flights that departed after midnight, but for all intents and purposes, the Australian government had us all out of Bali the day after the bombing. And our destinations were not a simple matter. First and foremost, Penny and Paul Anasich, as well as Jennifer Williamson's husband, Bruce, needed the kind of medical care that could not wait for a flight to Sydney. Penny remembered her flight, as well as her concerns for her still unconscious husband.
And then, of course, I was airlifted to Singapore. Not in a big plane, I was strapped up to the roof. It was like a stretcher. It was an emergency plane, and my body was actually totally shrapnel and burnt by the sand. So I just went immediately into hospital and was scrubbed down. I didn't know where Paul was, although what I did think on the way there was he won't recover. I'm in so much pain, Paul won't survive this.
For those whose injuries were serious but not life-threatening, the Royal Australian Air Force sent Hercules planes to airlift them to hospital in Darwin. However, it was not a simple matter of leaving Sanglah and boarding the plane, as Julia Letterwash remembers.
Then the army started coming in, or the Air Force or something, to work out how they were going to transport us out, but they couldn't have any charge or any opinion or anything, and because we weren't their property, or the property of Indonesians while we're in Indonesia. And that was all political. And then the next thing, they transported us, I think that night, by ambulances to the airport. And once we got onto the tarmac to get on the plane, there was the handover on the tarmac was when we became the property of the Australians.
But before being handed over to the Australian presence, Vicky Griffiths received an unfortunate but unforgettable farewell.
So they put me on a stretcher in the back of an ambulance and they went to pull me up. They didn't put the legs down, so I dropped from about 6 foot high, not 6 foot, quite a few feet high, straight down to the ground. And if you can imagine, the gurney hit the ground before I did, so I was quite high up in the air. Hit the ground. And the Balinese, funny, when they get nervous they laugh, or when they get embarrassed they laugh, which is not our custom. So they all were laughing, because they were embarrassed. But that's their way they are.
Did it hurt?
No, I didn't get hurt.
Despite not being a patient, Dad was also afforded a seat on the Hercules. I asked him that most basic airline question. How was the flight?
Uncomfortable. What I remember about the Hercules was talking to one of the RAF crew. He said, this plane is fitted out to retrieve bodies, but I think he's roughly 90 bodies. So, like the beds were 3 high. Obviously we weren't, we only took 12 beds or something. And the other amazing thing about the Hercules was just how organised and well-trained the RAF staff were. They must have done drill for that so many times, because I've been working in hospitals for nearly 30 years. It's just never done right. The wardsmen change, the nursing staff change. People saying, you get the head. No, you get the feet. It's when you're in the army, it's drill. It was very impressive. So you didn't want to get in their way.
The drills and efficiency, however, did not leave much room for bedside manner, as Vicky and Kim Griffiths learned.
They're not trained to be polite, hey, how you feeling? They just fix things, So they said, are you all right? I said, yeah, I'll be fine. But I said, weirdly, my finger is really causing me a lot of grief. It's dislocated. So he didn't even say, well, just take a breath while I do this. He just got my hand, yanked my finger, yelped, screamed, and he just went, there you go, and went on to the next person. That's how they're trained. They're trained for warfare, these medics. So, they don't say, you'll be right, love, or I'll give you an injected painkiller or anything.
Well, the guy, the same medic came and said, what's wrong with you? And I said, oh, not too much. I said, I've got this stitches here where a piece of glass was, and he looked at it and he said, they wouldn't have scrubbed that. He didn't say, you probably get an infection. He said, they wouldn't have scrubbed that. And he got a scalpel out and just cut the stitches out.
Without even saying. He vanished.
I blacked out.
Kim being sliced open on the tarmac stood out in Dad's memory as well, although he was somewhat sympathetic to the Australian Defence Force doctor cutting out stitches.
There were other Australian doctors there, and they were stitching up shrapnel wounds, which is a no-no. You don't do that, because you're just trapping infection. Most of the people by the time I got there had all their minor injuries sewn up. So when the RAF doctors flew in, the first thing they did was pull all the stitches out. I mean, all those wounds healed up. You're talking about up to 10 centimetre scars, torn open flesh, but often hiding shrapnel, ball bearings or something. One of the emergency surgeons who, I think he came from Adelaide in the RAF, was annoyed at the number of people who had stitches, including Kim Griffiths, and he was just picking stitches out while Kim was standing up, and Kim was saying, what are you doing? and then Kim fainted, and I said to this doctor, listen, go easy, would you? There's just no need to be this aggressive. If you're going to take the stitches out, it's hardly an emergency. Do it when he's lying down.
With the stitches removed and the Australians aboard, the Hercules was preparing to take off. although there was one final diplomatic hurdle to be overcome regarding a Japanese citizen who had been injured in the bombing and needed further medical care.
When the Hercules was getting ready to take off, Tony Abbott said, "I don't want this to appear that Australians have flown in, grabbed their own and disappear. Can we make it obvious that to the Indonesians that anybody who needs transport to Darwin is welcome on the flight?" But then there was this diplomatic to and fro where Tony Abbott couldn't say, "We're taking the Japanese guy," or the RAF couldn't, that's abduction, but they could take him if the Japanese government asked. And so the message had to go back to Tokyo. Australia has a Hercules about to take off. Is there anything we can do to help? So we were held up for half hour or so before the Japanese guy was transferred, which was the right thing. But I think Tony Abbott also wanted to say that the Indonesians were, or anyone seriously injured could come to Darwin.
Look, I honestly can't remember, but certainly I was determined that the Australians would get the best possible treatment as quickly as possible. Any help you can give to others is great, but in the end, your first duty, your principal responsibility is to your fellow Australians. And your father, because he was so involved, this would have been one of the most, if not the most traumatic day of his life, to suddenly find himself dealing with an atrocity involving everyone who he'd been travelling with, and indeed his own son. For me, this was an extraordinary day. I've had quite a few extraordinary days over the years. For your dad, this would be a day that would have been utterly seared in his memory.
Finally, there was the matter of getting the rest of us home. Around 30 people in total, of whom the vast majority were teenagers. And the parents of most of these kids were either flying to a hospital in Singapore, a hospital in Darwin, or would never leave Bali. As for the parental presence, it was really down to just two people. Geraldine O'Connor, who was the one other parent who hadn't gone to Jimba the previous night, and my mum, Margaret Frost.
That was one of the things that I thought was never really acknowledged was, there was Margaret and Geraldine with all of those kids, trying to keep them all safe and in the motel and reassured about their parents. Something never really acknowledged. I probably told you that before, but I think Margaret and Geraldine did a lot, and they then had to organise everyone to get on planes back home.
As for Mum's take on that situation, she gave credit to those teenagers, although she also had the foresight to ensure everyone's safety all the way to the airport.
But the little kids went and packed up their parents' room. They were amazing. Had to get them to get all their passports, and I had to give them to this woman who was the embassy official. And she then organised, and then Qantas came to the fore and said, "We'll make sure everyone gets back safely." And I remember just saying to this woman, they were going to organise a bus, and I said, "We have to have a police escort." And she's going, "What?" I said, "We have to have a police escort to the airport, because I'm really worried that they're going to blow us up. They want to kill us and they're going to blow us up." And she's going, "Yeah, all right." So we did. We got a police escort.
If the police escort seems like overkill, well, all I can say is that at the time, I was just glad it was there, because I was scared to death. I remember getting onto that coach for the airport. I remember surveying the scene in front of me. A busload of pale, exhausted, terrified kids. And I remember thinking, this isn't happening. Next time, on Forgotten Bombs, Bali, 2005.
And then we're just like, "Oh yeah, where's mum and dad?" And then everyone in the room just like panicked, opened their eyes and like, "They're unaccounted for," was their words.
I blame myself because the person who did the bomb used to be my student, I know before, especially Nordin and Azhari.
It all goes quiet, and he yells out that he's been injured and he can't move. This is the time where he's putting on his suicide vest.
Forgotten Bombs, Bali 2005 is written, produced and presented by me, Joe Frost. Audio production by Elliot Beavis. Original music by Dan Flegg. Cover art by Alita Letterwash. To check out Alita's piece in its entirety, as well as for a list of sources, episode transcripts and more, head to our website, 9.6.com.au. That's number 9, POINT, number 6. You can find David Craig on Instagram at official Dr. David Craig. Special thanks to my family. All the thanks to Fiona. Forgotten Bombs is a 9.6 digital production.